This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming service built by all your favorite YouTubers, when you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below. Here's a history question. What year was the United States Postal Service founded? I'll give you a hint. It's probably older than you think. Need another hint? The first Postmaster General was a man named Benjamin Franklin. While I'm sure that helps you narrow down the time frame pretty significantly, you might still be surprised to learn that the Postal Service was created almost a full year before the United States even became a country. Over the next 2.5 centuries, the U.S. Postal Service performed the critical task of making the many separate states feel like a connected whole, delivering mail across the country to cities and rural areas alike. It shipped newspapers for free or nearly free, providing valuable information to citizens even in remote areas or new settlements. Over time, roads created for use by the Postal Service became the country's first interstate roadways. In more recent decades, the Post Office has delivered hundreds of millions of essential prescriptions every year for people all over the country, delivering a whopping 1.2 billion prescriptions in 2019. Over its long existence, the United States Postal Service has existed only to improve the lives of all Americans, and it's succeeded. With such a stellar track record, it seems strange that the USPS is drawing so much negative attention today. In this episode, we're going to discuss some common misconceptions about the Postal Service and why it's such a critical part of American infrastructure. Let's start with a little background on the current drama surrounding the Postal Service. The USPS is fairly unique among government agencies. While operated under the executive branch of the US government, the Post Office is actually an independent agency that raises its own funding. Its stated purpose is to serve all Americans regardless of geography at a uniform price and quality. The Postal Service is an inherently nonpartisan operation and is one of a very small number of government agencies explicitly authorized by the US Constitution. The reason for all the heated discussion today is some misconceptions regarding the practice of voting by mail and the installment of a Postmaster General who is blatantly undermining the effectiveness of the Postal Service. The situation is rapidly evolving and will no doubt be very different by the time this video goes live, but here are the basic facts. On June 15, 2020, a man named Louis DeJoy was appointed as Postmaster General. A rabid partisan operative and campaign megadonor, DeJoy immediately began his work of disrupting the effectiveness of the Postal Service. He scrapped employee overtime, shuffled around or simply removed post office leadership, and, most alarmingly, has ordered the removal of mail sorting machines and drop boxes around the country. This would have been bad enough in a normal year, but right now, what DeJoy is doing should be considered criminal. 2020 is not only both a census year and an election year, it's also marked by a pandemic that demands people stay out of densely populated areas like polling stations. By slowing down the sorting, distributing, and receiving of mail, DeJoy is attempting to make it impossible to handle what's expected to be a record-breaking volume of mailed ballots. This deliberate mismanagement of the Postal Service is an obvious attempt to skew the election odds towards a certain outcome. But it's also an attack on one of the most fundamental services in the country. Luckily, there's been some serious bipartisan pushback on this ludicrous attempt at voter suppression, including citizens showing up to protest at DeJoy's home. That's a good sign. But, as with anything, certain groups, news networks, and individuals will attempt to spin the assault on the post office as positive change. The only way the public will consent to the dismantling of the USPS is if they're force-fed bad information and accept it as fact. So, let's take a look at some of these false claims. First and foremost is the supposed threat of voter fraud. The idea that someone could request a ballot in someone else's name, or the ballots could be forged, or any number of other unlikely scenarios. It takes very little effort to disprove this fear-mongering. According to an online database of election fraud cases, over the past 20 years, there have only been 143 convictions involving mailed-in ballots. That's 8 cases per year, across the entire nation. Would you like to see what that looks like as a percentage? 0.00006% of all votes cast. No voting system is perfect, including in-person voting, which has its own cases of fraud. But as with mail-in voting, it's exceptionally rare, and the fact that news networks and the president are touting election fraud as a major problem is not only blatantly false, it should also raise red flags that certain groups are ramping up to cast doubt on the results of the coming presidential election. To put the risk of mail-in ballot fraud in perspective, you have a greater chance of getting struck by lightning than we have of witnessing a single case of voter fraud. Voter fraud in any form is exceedingly rare, and anyone who tries to tell you otherwise is not acting in good faith. Next, there's the complaint that the Postal Service is a government-run operation, and is therefore slow, mismanaged, and in debt. This is wrong on a number of counts. First, as we mentioned earlier in the video, the USPS is an independent agency which raises its own funds. It's not the bureaucratic mess free market enthusiasts would have you believe. The fact that you can send a letter from anywhere in the US and have it delivered anywhere else in the country, no matter how remote, in just a few days is pretty remarkable. FedEx and UPS can't do that. In fact, they often hand off their mail to the US Postal Service for final delivery to remote or hard-to-reach areas because they can't or won't do it themselves. The Postal Service will. Regarding their financial trouble, it all traces back to a piece of 2006 legislation that went largely unnoticed back then. It was called the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, and it placed highly unusual and crippling restrictions on the post office. For example, even though the USPS already had good healthcare and retirement plans, this new legislation demanded they prepay healthcare benefits to retirees on a 50-year schedule, which started with a requirement to set aside $5 billion per year for 10 years. This was unheard of and completely crippled the USPS. They went from operating in the black with a healthy income to posting an annual loss of $3.8 billion in just 3 years. In retrospect, it's clear that the main goal of the Accountability and Enhancement Act was to hamstring the Postal Service in the hopes of it eventually failing and leaving a gap that private companies could fill. The USPS had been thriving and was planning to add new electric vehicles to their fleet when the act was passed. Convenient timing. It's almost as if the corporatists in power didn't want a public service to do so well. People are quick to forget that the USPS was humming along nicely and doing just fine before bipartisan legislation attempted to destroy one of the oldest and most successful public services in the country. Even after taking a brutal beating in 2006, the legislation accounting for 74% of its net losses to this day, the USPS is still delivering mail to every single American who needs it. Another common refrain is that private companies are more efficient. This one is so ingrained in the American psyche that it's now considered a sort of universal truth. Just look at SpaceX, they say. Elon Musk has done more for spaceflight than NASA ever did. While some kudos is deserved, Musk is, after all, the first person to needlessly launch a car into space. These people neglect to mention, or probably simply don't realize, that private ventures like SpaceX exist thanks to billions of dollars of funding from the government. And, not to knock Muskites too hard, they do also tend to forget that NASA put human beings on the moon half a century ago, a feat that no private company has ever replicated, even with dramatically more advanced technology. Okay, I think that should spark a war in the comments. Now back to the post office. Since the USPS is technically a government operation, even if it's actually independent, people will latch on to that old myth that it simply can't be as efficient or effective as private companies. We mentioned earlier that companies like FedEx and UPS hand off some of their more difficult deliveries to the Postal Service. So does Amazon, one of the most successful private businesses on the planet. If the richest man on Earth can't make his company do what the poorly funded Postal Service can, how can anyone claim that private companies are better at their jobs than their government counterparts? The truth of the matter is that companies like FedEx, UPS, and Amazon could make these deliveries themselves, they just don't want to because they're not profitable. It takes a lot more effort to deliver a package to hard-to-reach or very rural areas, and that costs money. So, while they may be good at delivering to the suburbs, they don't feel any obligation to service the rest of the population. The Postal Service guarantees equal service to every single American because that's their job. They don't exist to turn a massive profit. They only exist to serve the people of the United States. Finally, defenders of the ransacking of the post office are quick to imply that voting by mail is some radical new idea that will lead to unforeseen consequences. Here's the thing. Americans have been voting by mail since the Civil War. Soldiers received ballots by mail and sent them back by mail. That was over 150 years ago. Voting by mail is not a new idea. Over the past century and a half, the process has gotten safer and more organized. Today, we have tens of millions of Americans receiving their ballot in the mail instead of at a polling station. We have citizens all over the world making their voices heard by mail-in ballots, including military personnel and citizens working or studying overseas. 5 states already conduct all of their voting by mail. Those states are Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, and Utah, with California and others hoping to join this year because of the threat posed by the coronavirus. As we saw earlier, the rate of voter fraud is minuscule and not restricted to mail-in voting. There is zero evidence that there has ever been or ever will be widespread voter fraud. The systems we have in place do a good job preventing it, and they will only get better as we learn from the emergency situation caused by the pandemic. But regardless of efficacy, people need to understand that this is not a partisan issue. Officials from all points of the political spectrum are calling for better access to mail-in voting, and it's not hard to see why. When our country is in the throes of a deadly pandemic, and the medical community is telling us we need to stay inside and keep our distance from other people, does it seem wise to cram hundreds of bodies into polling stations, many of which are staffed by elderly and immunocompromised individuals? Of course not. That would be a disaster. Current projections expect a 3-fold increase in voting by mail over the 2016 election. And really, it should be much more than that. Every single person in America should have the opportunity to vote by mail in a situation like this. We should not have to choose between our right to vote and our health. This is what makes the dismantling of the US Postal Service so unconscionable. In a year when we expect drastically higher mail-in ballot volume, removing the capability to process those ballots in time for the election is irresponsible and downright un-American. Voting is a right, and if we can't safely go to the polls, we need to be able to vote in another way. Voting by mail has been around for a century and a half. The Postal Service is amazing at its job and is committed to serving each American equally. The verdict is clear. The United States Postal Service is essential, and with their help, we can give every American the right to vote safely. If you've watched my last few videos, you'll notice that YouTube has been demonetizing a lot of them. That's why some of my creator friends and I teamed up to build Nebula, a streaming platform built by and for YouTubers like me, so we don't have to worry about demonetization. Since Nebula is all about creating thoughtful content, we've partnered with CuriosityStream, an established streaming platform with a solid track record of caring about great educational content and the financial security of those who produce it. CuriosityStream is an online streaming service with thousands of nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. You can find tons of great episodes like Coronavirus: Psychology of a Pandemic, which is a fantastic watch if you enjoyed this week's video. As educational creators ourselves, we love CuriosityStream. So, we've worked out a deal, where if you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below, you'll also get access to Nebula, 100% free. For a limited time, CuriosityStream is offering 26% off their annual plan. That's less than $15 a year for both CuriosityStream and Nebula, which, in my humble opinion, is a pretty great deal. Since we're all stuck inside anyway, why not spend some time watching fascinating documentaries on CuriosityStream? Or check out the original content from all your favorite creators on Nebula. There really is something for everyone, and by signing up at the link below, you're helping us produce more content without the fear of demonetization. Give CuriosityStream a shot, and get free access to Nebula when you sign up using the link below. It really does help support my channel and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like it, consider subscribing to stay up to date with my latest episodes. If you hated it, go ahead and drop a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.